There is something quietly happening in your mind right now that most people never question. A continuous stream of thoughts is moving through your awareness. Ideas, memories, predictions, inner commentary, all appearing one after another, often without pause. And for most of your life, it probably felt obvious that these thoughts were you, that you were the thinker behind them, that they represented your identity, your intentions, your will. But what if that assumption isn't entirely accurate? Modern neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and many contemplative traditions are beginning to converge on an interesting observation. By the time you consciously notice a thought, the brain has already been processing information beneath awareness for a fraction of a second. In other words, the thought often arrives fully formed before you realize it's there. You don't hear the construction process. You only hear the result. This doesn't mean you have no agency. It means something subtler. Conscious awareness may be less like a factory producing thoughts and more like a space where thoughts appear, get noticed, and sometimes get acted upon. If you want to explore this directly, try a simple observation right now. Don't try to control anything. Just watch your next thought as it arises. Notice how it comes without effort. You didn't schedule it. You didn't assemble it piece by piece. It simply showed up. And then another one follows. From a predictive brain perspective, this makes sense. Your nervous system is constantly scanning past experience, environmental cues, emotional signals, and memory patterns to anticipate what might happen next. Thoughts are often outputs of that predictive system, efficient, automatic, and largely unconscious until they surface in awareness. The important distinction here is not philosophical. It's practical. Because when every thought is automatically treated as me, emotional reactivity increases. Fearful thoughts feel like personal danger. Critical thoughts feel like self-judgment. Limiting assumptions start to shape perception before reality even has a chance to present itself. But when thoughts are seen as mental events, phenomena occurring within awareness rather than definitions of identity, a small but meaningful shift happens. There is space. And in that space, observation becomes possible. You can notice a thought without immediately becoming it. You can recognize mental noise without assuming it reflects truth. You can remain present, even while the mind continues its activity. This shift doesn't require suppressing thinking. It doesn't require adopting beliefs or forcing positivity. It simply begins with noticing the difference between awareness itself and the content passing through it. And that distinction, subtle as it seems, is often where deeper clarity begins, because the question slowly emerges. If thoughts appear in awareness, who or what is aware of them? That's where our exploration starts. Now that you've begun to notice thoughts as events appearing in awareness, let's deepen that observation in a simple and practical way. For a moment, try something that sounds almost paradoxical. Instead of trying to control your thinking, allow it. Let thoughts arise exactly as they do, without resistance, without correction, without commentary about whether they should or shouldn't be there. This is not a meditation technique in the traditional sense. It's closer to a perceptual adjustment. You're not stopping the mind. You're observing how it actually functions. What most people discover almost immediately is this. Thoughts keep coming whether you invite them or not. Plans about later today. Random memories. Evaluations about what you're hearing right now. Even thoughts about whether this exercise is working. And importantly, they tend to arrive spontaneously. Cognitive science describes the brain as a predictive system. It continuously models possible futures based on past experiences, emotional states, environmental input, and internal biological signals. From that perspective, thoughts are not always deliberate creations. Many are automatic predictions, simulations, or pattern completions. They help you navigate reality efficiently, but they also carry inherited assumptions, learned fears, cultural narratives, and outdated interpretations that may no longer reflect your current situation. When awareness automatically identifies with every thought, these predictions start shaping perception. You begin noticing evidence that confirms them. Neutral situations get interpreted through old frameworks. Emotional responses activate before conscious evaluation even occurs. This is not a flaw. It's simply how adaptive brains work. But awareness adds another dimension. Awareness can observe the process itself. And once observation enters the picture, something interesting happens. There is a slight decoupling between the thought and the sense of identity. Instead of, "I am anxious," the experience subtly shifts toward, "An anxious thought is present." Instead of, "This will definitely go wrong," it becomes, "A prediction about failure is arising." The content of the thought may remain the same, but your relationship to it changes. This shift has measurable psychological effects. Research on metacognitive awareness, the ability to notice one's own thinking processes, shows reductions in stress reactivity, improved emotional regulation, and increased cognitive flexibility. Essentially, when thoughts are observed rather than automatically believed, the nervous system has more room to respond instead of react. From a subjective standpoint, it often feels like mental spaciousness. Thoughts continue, but they lose some of their urgency. They resemble weather passing through the sky, rather than permanent structures defining identity. And that brings us to an important clarification. Observing thoughts does not mean suppressing them. It does not mean replacing them with positive ones. And it certainly does not mean eliminating thinking altogether. It means recognizing thinking as one activity occurring within awareness, not the entirety of who you are. As this recognition stabilizes, perception begins to shift subtly. Reactions soften, attention widens, and experiences that were previously filtered out by habitual thinking sometimes become visible. Not because reality changed, but because the observer did. And that observation will become central as we continue exploring how perception, identity, and experience interact. To understand this more clearly, it helps to look at what neuroscience has gradually been uncovering about how thoughts arise. For a long time, it felt intuitive to assume that conscious intention comes first, that you decide, then your brain acts. But experimental research has repeatedly shown something more complex. In several well-known studies on decision-making, measurable brain activity associated with an action begins slightly before the person reports consciously deciding to act. The delay is small, fractions of a second, but consistent enough to challenge the traditional idea that conscious thought is always the origin point. This doesn't eliminate free will, as some interpretations suggest. Instead, it points toward a layered process. Unconscious systems prepare possibilities, and conscious awareness becomes aware of them slightly afterward. Awareness then participates in refining, approving, or redirecting those impulses. In that sense, consciousness may function less like a command center issuing orders and more like an integrative observer coordinating complex processes already in motion. That perspective aligns with everyday experience more than it might initially seem. Consider how often solutions to problems appear unexpectedly, in the shower, during a walk, or just as you're falling asleep. The mind was working in the background long before awareness noticed the result. Or think about how emotions sometimes arise before you can explain them. Interpretation often follows feeling, not the other way around. Your nervous system is constantly processing information outside conscious awareness. Sensory input, memory associations, physiological signals, social cues. Thoughts frequently emerge as summaries of that hidden processing. And because awareness encounters only the finished thought, it's easy to assume authorship. But here's where the distinction becomes practical rather than theoretical. If every thought is treated as deliberate and personal, emotional identification intensifies. A passing worry becomes my anxiety. A self-critical thought becomes my inadequacy. A fleeting doubt becomes my limitation. Identity contracts around mental content that may simply be transient processing output. When thoughts are recognized as events produced by complex neural activity, sometimes useful, sometimes outdated, there's more flexibility. You can evaluate them rather than automatically embody them. This is not detachment in the sense of indifference, it's functional clarity. For example, if a thought appears saying, "This situation might not go well," awareness can notice it, consider available information, and respond appropriately. But if awareness automatically equates with the thought, the body may enter stress mode before any real evaluation happens. The difference is subtle but significant. Observation creates response options. Identification often collapses them. Over time, people who cultivate this observational stance frequently report a quieter mental background. Not necessarily fewer thoughts, but less compulsion to react to each one. Attention becomes more available for present experience rather than continuous internal commentary. And interestingly, when mental noise decreases, perception sometimes feels sharper. Conversations are heard more clearly. Environmental details become noticeable. Emotional signals from others become easier to read. Again, reality itself hasn't changed, but the interface through which it's experienced has. And that interface, the relationship between awareness and thought, is what we'll explore next, especially how repeated thought patterns begin shaping expectation, perception, and ultimately lived experience. Once you begin seeing thoughts as mental events rather than personal identity, another layer becomes visible. Thoughts don't just pass through awareness, they quietly shape how reality is perceived. This happens because perception is never purely objective. The brain constantly filters information to keep experience manageable. Out of the immense amount of sensory input available at any moment, only a small fraction reaches conscious awareness. And what gets selected is heavily influenced by expectation, memory, and emotional conditioning. In practical terms, thoughts act like interpretive lenses. If a recurring thought suggests that situations are likely to be stressful, attention naturally scans for signs of tension. Neutral expressions may be interpreted as disapproval. Ambiguous outcomes may feel negative. Even silence can take on unintended meaning. Not because reality necessarily changed, but because attention was directed toward confirming an existing mental model. This predictive filtering is essential for survival. It allows fast decision-making and efficient adaptation, but it can also perpetuate outdated interpretations long after circumstances have changed. For example, someone who once experienced repeated criticism may develop automatic thoughts, anticipating judgment. Years later, even in supportive environments, the nervous system may still prepare defensively. The thought arises, the body responds, perception narrows, all before conscious evaluation fully occurs. Awareness plays a critical role here. When awareness automatically identifies with the thought, the filter operates invisibly. The person simply experiences reality as stressful, difficult, or limiting. But when awareness observes the thought instead of merging with it, the filter becomes visible. And visibility introduces choice, not forced positivity, not denial, just the possibility of seeing more than one interpretation. Psychological research often refers to this as cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. People who develop this capacity tend to show greater emotional resilience, improved decision-making, and more adaptive social responses. From the inside, it usually feels like increased mental space. A thought arises. This might go badly. Awareness notices it. But instead of immediate emotional contraction, there's a pause. In that pause, other information becomes available. Context, evidence, intuition, sensory detail. The full situation, rather than the filtered prediction. Over time, this shift subtly alters experience. Interactions feel less tense. Opportunities that previously went unnoticed become visible. Creative solutions emerge more easily. Not because reality suddenly changed its rules, but because perception stopped narrowing around habitual expectations. It's similar to adjusting focus on a lens. The environment remains the same, yet clarity changes. And this leads to a deeper question. If repeated thoughts shape perception and perception influences behavior, how much of what we call reality is actually filtered experience rather than direct observation? That question doesn't require a definitive answer right now, but holding it open allows the next layer of exploration, how patterns from past experience continue generating thoughts automatically, often without current relevance. And understanding that process is where genuine internal freedom begins to expand. Once you begin observing thoughts without immediately identifying with them, a pattern usually becomes obvious. Many thoughts repeat, sometimes subtly, sometimes almost word for word. The themes may change slightly, but the emotional tone and underlying assumptions often remain consistent. This repetition isn't random. From a neuroscience perspective, the brain is fundamentally a prediction engine. It uses past experience to anticipate what might happen next. This predictive process helps conserve energy, increase reaction speed, and reduce uncertainty. Instead of analyzing every situation from scratch, the brain references stored patterns, memories, emotional associations, social learning, and even cultural narratives become part of these predictive templates. When current circumstances resemble past situations, even superficially, the associated thoughts tend to reactivate. And importantly, this can happen without conscious intention. A conversation tone might resemble something from years ago. A facial expression might echo a previous interaction. Even an internal emotional state can trigger memory-linked interpretations. Thoughts arise as summaries of those associations, not necessarily as accurate reflections of the present moment. This explains why two people can experience the same situation very differently. Their predictive templates are different. Their nervous systems highlight different details. Their thoughts interpret events through distinct internal histories. Awareness changes how this process unfolds. When thoughts are automatically equated with identity, predictive patterns operate invisibly. The person simply experiences the outcome: tension, anticipation, doubt, or confidence. But when awareness observes the thought as a mental event, the predictive mechanism becomes more transparent. You begin to notice not just what you're thinking, but why certain thoughts tend to appear. And that recognition introduces a subtle form of freedom. Because once a pattern is visible, it becomes adjustable, not instantly erased, not forcefully replaced, but gradually updated through new experience and conscious attention. Psychology sometimes describes this as memory reconsolidation, the brain's capacity to revise stored patterns when new evidence contradicts old assumptions. When awareness notices a predictive thought but responds differently than before, the nervous system receives updated data. Over time, prediction models shift. Stressful situations may begin to feel more neutral. Uncertainty may feel less threatening. Possibilities that previously seemed unlikely may start to register as realistic. Again, this isn't about positive thinking. It's about reducing automatic identification with outdated predictive loops. Interestingly, as this happens, mental energy often becomes more available. Less effort goes into maintaining defensive interpretations. Attention becomes freer to engage with what is actually happening rather than what is anticipated. And that opens the door to another dimension of understanding, one that extends beyond personal history. Because not all recurring thoughts originate from individual experience. Some emerge from broader social, informational, and cultural environments that continuously influence perception. Recognizing that layer can further expand awareness of how thinking actually operates and how selectively engaging with mental content can shape clarity, focus, and emotional balance. That's where we'll continue next. As awareness becomes more stable in observing thought patterns, another realization often emerges. Not every thought originates strictly from personal experience. Some thoughts reflect broader informational environments that we continuously absorb, often without noticing. Human cognition is deeply social. Language, beliefs, emotional reactions, and even perceived priorities are shaped by interaction with others, media exposure, cultural narratives, and shared attention cycles. The brain doesn't operate in isolation. It constantly exchanges signals with its surroundings. This means thinking is partly individual and partly collective. Consider how certain concerns suddenly become widespread. Economic uncertainty, technological change, health anxieties, social debates. Entire populations can find themselves thinking about similar topics simultaneously. Information flows through news, conversations, social media, and ambient cultural signals. The nervous system absorbs these inputs and integrates them into predictive processing, often without deliberate choice. You may notice thoughts about situations you're not directly experiencing, opinions about people you've never met, emotional reactions to events happening far from your daily life. These thoughts feel personal because they occur in your mind, yet their origin is frequently informational exposure rather than direct experience. Awareness helps differentiate this. When thoughts are automatically identified as mine, external informational input blends seamlessly into identity. Stress from distant events feels immediate. Collective anxieties feel personal. Mental bandwidth becomes occupied by narratives that may have little relevance to your present environment. But when awareness observes the thought as an event, origin becomes easier to question. Is this arising from direct experience, from personal memory, or from collective informational input? That simple inquiry can significantly reduce cognitive load. Psychological research shows that constant exposure to emotionally charged information increases baseline stress levels, even when individuals are not directly affected by the events themselves. The nervous system reacts to perceived threat signals regardless of physical proximity. Observation introduces regulation. You don't need to suppress information or disconnect from the world. But awareness allows selective engagement. Some thoughts require action. Others require understanding. Many simply require acknowledgement without prolonged mental investment. This selective attention is not avoidance. It's cognitive hygiene, maintaining clarity about what directly concerns your lived experience versus what belongs to broader informational ecosystems. As this distinction stabilizes, mental noise often decreases. Attention becomes more grounded in immediate reality. Emotional responses become more proportionate to actual circumstances rather than amplified by continuous informational input. And interestingly, this clarity tends to enhance decision-making. When attention isn't fragmented across multiple external narratives, perception sharpens. Intuition becomes easier to hear. Priorities become clearer. From an experiential standpoint, it can feel like returning to a more stable internal baseline, less reactive, more present. And that stability sets the stage for something deeper. Because once personal and collective thought patterns are both observed rather than automatically identified with, awareness itself begins to stand out more distinctly, not as an abstract idea, but as a consistent background presence. And understanding that presence is where the next part of this exploration leads. When awareness stops automatically identifying with thoughts, whether personal or collectively influenced, a new question naturally emerges. If thoughts are events appearing within awareness, what role does awareness itself play in shaping experience? Physics introduced the concept of the observer effect in very specific experimental contexts. At subatomic scales, measurement influences outcomes. Translating that directly into daily life would be an oversimplification. But the metaphor offers something useful psychologically. Observation changes interaction. Internally, this becomes quite practical. When thoughts are unconsciously believed, they influence perception, emotional tone, posture, tone of voice, decision-making, and attention allocation. These factors subtly shape interactions with the environment and with other people. Outcomes then tend to reflect those internal states, often reinforcing the original thought patterns. It's not mystical causation. It's recursive feedback. Thought, perception, behavior, response, reinforced thought. Awareness introduces a pause in that loop. Instead of immediate identification, there is noticing. That noticing often reduces emotional charge just enough for alternative responses to become available. The same situation can then unfold differently, not because reality changed externally, but because the interaction dynamics shifted. Consider a simple example. If someone expects tension in a conversation, their body may subtly prepare for conflict. Tightened posture, guarded tone, narrowed attention. The other person often senses this unconsciously and responds accordingly. The expectation appears confirmed. But if awareness notices the expectation as just a thought, the physiological preparation may soften. Tone changes. Attention broadens. The interaction frequently becomes less tense. Same external situation, different internal observation. Different outcome trajectory. Psychology sometimes calls this expectancy shaping or perceptual priming. Social neuroscience adds that humans constantly read subtle physiological and emotional cues from each other. Awareness, by modulating internal reactivity, indirectly modulates these signals. This doesn't mean awareness controls reality, but it does influence how reality is engaged with. And engagement matters. Over time, reduced identification with reactive thought patterns often correlates with increased behavioral flexibility. People report feeling less compelled to defend identity narratives, less reactive to ambiguity, and more capable of adjusting responses moment by moment. Creativity tends to increase in these conditions as well. When attention isn't locked into confirming existing assumptions, the brain becomes more open to novel associations and unexpected solutions. Subjectively, many describe this as increased coherence, not a mystical state necessarily, but a sense of internal alignment where perception, emotion, and action feel less fragmented. And coherence tends to stabilize experience, not by eliminating challenge, but by reducing unnecessary internal resistance. As this stabilization develops, awareness itself begins to feel less like an occasional observer and more like the consistent background of experience. Thoughts, emotions, sensations, and events continue to arise, but they do so within a broader field of noticing rather than defining identity. And recognizing that background presence more clearly is what we'll explore next, because it leads directly into how identity itself may reorganize when thinking is no longer the primary reference point. As awareness becomes more familiar, something subtle often begins to shift. It's not dramatic at first. It's more like a quiet reorganization in how identity is experienced. For most people, identity is built largely from thoughts. Internal narratives accumulate over time. I'm good at this. I struggle with that. This is how life works for me. These narratives feel solid because they repeat frequently. They become reference points for decisions, expectations, and emotional responses. But when thoughts are consistently observed rather than automatically believed, their defining power starts to soften. The thoughts may still appear, but they no longer carry the same authority. This can initially feel unfamiliar, sometimes even slightly disorienting. The mind has long relied on these narratives to create continuity and predictability. Without immediate identification, identity begins to feel less fixed and more fluid. Interestingly, psychology recognizes similar processes in cognitive flexibility research. Individuals who maintain looser attachment to self-narratives often adapt more effectively to change. They show greater resilience during uncertainty and recover more quickly from setbacks, not because they lack identity, but because their identity isn't rigidly tied to specific thought structures. From a neurobiological perspective, this flexibility may reduce chronic stress activation. When identity isn't constantly being defended or validated, the nervous system often relaxes. Emotional responses become less all or nothing. Situations are evaluated more contextually. Subjectively, people often describe this as a sense of internal spaciousness. Instead of, "this is happening to me," there's more of a sense of, "this is happening, and I'm aware of it." The difference may sound subtle, but experientially it can reduce reactivity significantly. Decisions also tend to shift. When identity is thought-based, Choices often aim to reinforce the narrative, protecting status, avoiding perceived failure, confirming beliefs about oneself. When awareness becomes the primary reference point, decisions can feel more responsive to the present moment rather than to maintaining a storyline. Creativity frequently benefits from this shift. Without strict identity constraints, experimentation feels safer. Learning accelerates because mistakes are interpreted as information rather than threats to self-definition. Relationships can also become less pressured. Interactions feel less like performances requiring validation and more like exchanges occurring within shared presence. Again, none of this requires eliminating thought. Thinking remains essential for planning, communication, and problem-solving. The shift lies in recognizing that identity doesn't have to be constructed entirely from those thoughts. Awareness becomes the stable backdrop. Thought becomes a functional tool. And when that distinction stabilizes, another interesting observation often emerges. Reality itself can feel less rigid, not because external conditions necessarily change immediately, but because perception becomes less filtered by fixed self-concepts. Possibilities that previously felt inconsistent with identity start to appear more accessible. Behavioral choices widen, emotional responses soften, experience becomes more dynamic. And this evolving relationship between awareness, identity, and perception leads directly into the next layer of exploration. How sustained non-identification with thought patterns gradually influences how reality is interpreted and engaged with over time. As identity becomes less tightly anchored to thought patterns, perception often begins to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Not because reality itself suddenly transforms, but because the internal filters through which it is experienced become more flexible. Human perception is inherently selective. The nervous system constantly prioritizes certain signals while ignoring others. This filtering keeps experience manageable, but it also means that what we perceive is never the full picture. It's a curated version shaped by expectation, memory, and emotional relevance. Thought-based identity tends to stabilize those filters. If someone consistently thinks of themselves as unsuccessful, attention naturally highlights evidence confirming that narrative. Small achievements may go unnoticed. Opportunities may appear less visible. Neutral outcomes may be interpreted negatively. Over time, perception reinforces identity, and identity reinforces perception. Awareness interrupts this automatic reinforcement loop. When thoughts are observed instead of immediately believed, perceptual filtering loosens slightly. Attention becomes more distributed. Details that previously fell outside the expected narrative begin to register. Situations may feel less predetermined. This doesn't mean perception becomes perfectly objective. That's not how human cognition works. But it often becomes less constrained by past assumptions. Psychologically, this relates to attentional flexibility and cognitive openness. Studies show that individuals capable of stepping back from habitual thought patterns demonstrate increased adaptability, improved problem-solving, and greater tolerance for uncertainty. They're less likely to interpret ambiguous situations as threats and more likely to explore alternative interpretations. From a lived experience perspective, this can feel like increased possibility. Conversations may feel less scripted, decisions may feel less pressured, creative ideas may surface more easily. Importantly, this isn't forced optimism. It's simply reduced automatic narrowing of attention. The nervous system, no longer constantly defending identity narratives, has more bandwidth to register nuance. Emotional responses become more proportional. Situations can be evaluated with greater context rather than through pre-existing mental templates. This shift often affects behavior as well. When perception broadens, behavioral options expand. People may take actions they previously avoided, not because they suddenly changed personality, but because the internal prediction of failure or discomfort carries less weight. Experimentation becomes less threatening. And behavior, of course, influences outcomes. Again, not through mystical causation, but through interaction dynamics. How you perceive shapes how you respond. How you respond shapes how situations unfold. Over time, this recursive loop can significantly alter lived experience. Many people describe this phase as increased coherence, a sense that perception, emotion, and action are less fragmented. Decisions feel clearer. Interactions feel more grounded. Even challenges may feel less overwhelming because they're no longer filtered through rigid identity assumptions. And as coherence stabilizes, awareness itself becomes easier to recognize as the consistent background of experience, the element that remains present regardless of what thoughts, emotions, or circumstances arise. Understanding that background presence more fully is where our exploration naturally continues. Because once awareness becomes the primary reference point, the relationship between inner experience and external reality begins to feel fundamentally different. As awareness becomes the primary reference point rather than thought-based identity, one of the first noticeable changes tends to occur in how reactions unfold. Previously, thoughts often triggered immediate emotional responses. A critical comment might produce tension before conscious evaluation. An uncertain situation might activate worry automatically. A memory might influence mood without clear context. These reactions are not mistakes. They reflect efficient neural survival mechanisms shaped by past experience. But when awareness consistently observes thoughts instead of merging with them, reaction time subtly lengthens, not physically slower, experientially wider. There's a fraction of space between stimulus and response. And in that space, coherence begins to emerge. Coherence in this context doesn't mean perfection or constant calm. It refers to alignment between perception, emotional regulation, and behavioral response. The nervous system becomes less fragmented. Attention stabilizes. Internal signals synchronize more fluidly. Physiological research often associates coherence with balanced autonomic nervous system activity, reduced chronic stress activation, improved emotional regulation, and more stable attentional patterns. People frequently describe this state as clarity, groundedness, or presence, and importantly, coherence tends to influence interaction quality. When internal reactivity decreases, communication often becomes clearer. Listening improves, tone softens, nonverbal signals shift. Others tend to respond differently, sometimes without either person consciously noticing why. This is not about controlling others. It's about stabilizing internal conditions that shape interaction dynamics. Work environments provide a clear example. Someone operating from reactive thought patterns may perceive constant pressure, anticipate criticism, or interpret neutral feedback negatively. Behavior then reflects that anticipation. But when awareness reduces identification with those thoughts, perception widens. Feedback becomes information rather than threat. Decisions become less defensive. Performance often improves as a byproduct. Similarly, in creative contexts, reduced reactivity allows experimentation. Fear of failure carries less identity weight. Ideas flow more freely because they're not immediately evaluated against rigid self-concepts. Financial decision-making can also shift. When identity isn't entangled with every outcome, choices may become more measured. Risk assessment becomes clearer. Emotional impulsivity decreases. Across different life domains, the pattern is consistent. Less identification with reactive thoughts, more internal coherence, more adaptive engagement with reality. This does not eliminate uncertainty or difficulty. Challenges still occur, but responses often feel less chaotic, less personally threatening, and more proportionate to actual circumstances. Over time, many people notice something else as well. Experiences begin to feel less repetitive. Situations that once followed predictable emotional scripts start unfolding differently. Interactions feel fresher. Possibilities expand. Again, this isn't because reality suddenly changed its structure. It's because engagement with reality became less constrained by automatic internal narratives. And as this stabilizes, awareness itself becomes increasingly recognizable, not just during quiet reflection, but during conversation, work, movement, decision-making. everyday life. That ongoing recognition leads directly into the next phase of exploration. How sustained awareness influences long-term experience patterns and perception of opportunity. As awareness becomes more consistent and identification with automatic thought patterns decreases, many people begin noticing gradual changes in how experiences unfold over time. Not sudden transformations, not dramatic external shifts. More often, subtle pattern changes. Situations that once felt predictably stressful may feel more neutral. Interactions that previously triggered defensive reactions may unfold more smoothly. Opportunities that once seemed invisible may become easier to recognize. These changes are frequently misunderstood as external reality responding. But in many cases, what's actually happening is perceptual recalibration. When attention is no longer dominated by habitual thought filters, more information becomes available. Context is processed more accurately. Emotional responses become less amplified by anticipation. Decisions are made with broader awareness. And decisions shape experience. Behavioral psychology consistently shows that expectation influences interaction. Anticipating difficulty often leads to guarded behavior. Guarded behavior elicits guarded responses. The original expectation appears confirmed. But when awareness notices the expectation as a thought rather than a certainty, behavioral flexibility increases. Tone softens, curiosity replaces defensiveness. Conversations evolve differently, outcomes shift accordingly. This isn't positive thinking, it's reduced automatic prediction bias. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate. Work environments may feel less adversarial, relationships may feel less effortful, problem-solving becomes more adaptive. Even physical well-being can be influenced, as chronic cognitive stress tends to decrease when identification with repetitive worry lessens. Neuroscience supports this through research on neuroplasticity. The brain continuously updates neural pathways based on repeated experience. When awareness changes how thoughts are engaged with, emotional and behavioral patterns adjust. The nervous system learns new response options. Gradually, new baselines form. What once felt stressful may become manageable. What once felt impossible may feel approachable. What once felt overwhelming may feel structured. Importantly, awareness doesn't eliminate challenge. Complexity remains part of human experience. But identification with thought-based identity tends to amplify difficulty unnecessarily. Awareness reduces that amplification. Many describe this phase as increased stability combined with openness. Stability because reactions are less volatile. Openness because perception isn't constrained by fixed narratives. And that openness often reveals opportunities that previously went unnoticed, not because they suddenly appeared, but because attention became available to perceive them. Again, nothing mystical is required to explain this. It's a combination of attentional flexibility, emotional regulation, behavioral adaptation, and cognitive clarity. Yet subjectively, it can feel profound, because experience begins to align more closely with present reality rather than past expectation. And as this alignment stabilizes, awareness itself becomes less like a practice and more like a baseline mode of experience, quietly present regardless of circumstances. Understanding how to sustain that baseline in everyday life is where the next stage of this exploration naturally moves. As awareness becomes more familiar, it often shifts from being an occasional observation to something closer to a background stability. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move. External circumstances continue changing, but awareness itself begins to feel less intermittent, not constant in a rigid sense, just easier to access. This shift tends to happen gradually. At first, observation of thoughts may only occur during deliberate reflection. Then it starts appearing spontaneously during conversations, decision-making, or moments of stress. Eventually, awareness becomes a kind of reference point that remains present, even while thinking continues.